The Saturn never got a fair chance in the West. Sega's handling of the launch, the absence of key third-party titles, and the eventual shadow of the PlayStation combined to bury a library that deserved far better. These games are the reason the Saturn still has a devoted following decades later. RPGs that never got wide audiences and never stopped being worth finding. Albert Odyssey Legend of Eldine was one of the few Saturn RPGs that working designs brought west, which is both a blessing and a limitation. The localization is characteristically sharp. They had a genuine talent for comedic adaptation, but the dialogue liberties taken throughout are significant enough that the experience is somewhat different from what the Japanese release intended. Knowing that going in helps. The game itself is a traditional turn-based JRPG with a flying protagonist, aerial combat encounters, and a story about half-angel heritage and war that takes more swings at emotional resonance than its modest presentation suggests it would. The flying mechanic changes the feel of exploration in a way that few 2D JRPGs had attempted. The overworld is navigated differently when you can bypass terrain rather than being routed through it. Combat is competent rather than innovative, and players who have put serious time into 16-bit JRPGs will find the systems familiar enough that mastery comes quickly. The art direction is charming without being technically ambitious. Albert Odyssey isn't trying to reinvent anything. It's trying to be a well-made, emotionally engaged traditional RPG, and it mostly succeeds at that. For players who came to the Saturn looking for that specific kind of experience and found the library thinner than expected, this was one of the good ones. Mysteria: The Realms of Lore, released in Japan as Blazing Heroes, is a tactical RPG that launched with the Saturn in the West and got almost no attention because the console itself got almost no attention at that point. That timing buried a surprisingly competent strategy game that understood the genre well enough to bring something of its own rather than simply copying the Fire Emblem formula most contemporaries leaned on. The combat system is grid-based, but adds a facing mechanic that makes positioning feel genuinely meaningful. Attacking from the side or rear deals significantly more damage, which means every move involves reading where enemies are heading and cutting off their angles rather than just rushing the nearest target. I found it more satisfying than it had any right to be given how little fanfare surrounded its release or how quickly it disappeared from store shelves. The story is functional medieval fantasy that doesn't do anything surprising, and some of the character designs lean on archetypes without pushing past them. The localization is also rough in places, the kind of rough that comes from a rushed Western release rather than careful adaptation. But the strategic layer holds up better than most people who never played it would guess. And the facing mechanic alone gives it a mechanical identity that most tactics games of the era didn't have. Mysteria is one of those games that suffered entirely from circumstance rather than quality, and it deserves to be judged on what it actually is. Terra Fantastica is another Japanese exclusive that never made it west, and its obscurity outside Japan is compounded by how little documentation exists around it, even within the community that tracks down Saturn rarities. It's a tactical RPG with a rotating cast system where different characters are available for different missions, and the world building unfolds through the perspectives of multiple protagonists rather than a single central narrative thread. The tactical combat uses terrain elevation in ways that feel genuinely considered. Higher ground provides defensive and offensive advantages that the maps are clearly designed around rather than added as an afterthought. Scouting missions before full engagements give you information that actually matters to mission planning, which is a structural choice that most tactics games ignore entirely. The preparation phase before each battle felt meaningful in ways I didn't expect from a game this obscure. What makes it worth the effort of translation and import is the tonal maturity. Terra Fantastica deals with the consequences of war and political betrayal at a level of specificity that feels more novelistic than game-like in places. Characters make decisions that the narrative doesn't endorse just because the player made them, which was unusual then and remains unusual now. It's demanding in every sense, mechanically, narratively, and logistically. But the players who commit to it tend to find something that justifies all of that commitment. Magic Knight Rayearth is an adaptation of the clan manga that working designs localized, and unlike some rushed anime tie-ins of the era, it's an actual game with real production values and a combat system that earns your time. The action RPG mechanics are solid. The 3-character switching system gives encounters a tactical dimension most contemporary action RPGs ignored, and the story tracks closely enough to the source material to satisfy fans, while working independently for players who came in cold. The Saturn hardware is used well here. The pre-rendered backgrounds and sprite work combine in a way that gives the game a visual richness that most 2D Saturn titles matched only occasionally. Boss fights in particular are elaborate productions. Large sprites, complex patterns, and the kind of presentation that made the Saturn feel like a capable machine when developers understood what they were working with. The game is on the shorter side, and the RPG systems are lighter than a dedicated genre fan might prefer. The leveling and gear systems exist without demanding deep engagement, which makes it more accessible than it might otherwise be. Working Design's localization is good, but carries the same dialogue liberties that characterized all of their work, sharp and funny in ways that occasionally deviate from the original tone. Magic Knight Rayearth landed in a small window when the Saturn still had Western support, and it deserved the audience it nearly got. The Legend of Oasis is the sequel to Beyond Oasis on the Genesis, and it improved on that game in almost every way. Tighter combat, more elaborate dungeon design, and a spirit system with more depth than its predecessor managed. The action RPG structure feels somewhere between Zelda and Guardian Heroes, which is a comparison that should immediately suggest whether this game belongs on your list. You collect elemental spirits throughout the game that assist in combat, puzzle solving, and traversal in ways that actually change how you approach different situations. The fire spirit is aggressive in combat, but useful for burning obstacles. The ice spirit creates platforms. The wind spirit affects movement. Using them intelligently is where the game's mechanical depth lies. And the game is generous enough with how it introduces each one that experimentation feels rewarding rather than arbitrary. The visual presentation takes full advantage of what the Saturn could do with 2D sprite work. This is one of the better-looking 2D action games on the system, and the boss designs in particular are elaborate enough that they'd stand out in a fuller library. The game is relatively short, which some players will find unsatisfying given how well the system's developed. But what's there is extremely well-crafted, and it rewards replaying just to see how much of the spirit system you can actually leverage. Princess Crown is a 2D action RPG developed by Atlas and directed by George Kamitani, who later built Odin's Sphere and Dragon's Crown on the same foundation. Playing it now, after those later games, you can see exactly where the visual style and the combat philosophy originated. Playing it at the time, in Japan in 1997, there was simply nothing else that looked like it on any platform. The hand-drawn sprite work is extraordinary for the era. Characters animate with a weight and expressiveness that the Saturn's 2D capabilities allowed in ways 3D hardware wasn't yet replicating in the same style. The protagonist, Gradriel, moves through environments that feel illustrated rather than designed. Each area has a quality that suggests it was drawn before it was built. The combat has that deliberate, almost theatrical rhythm that Kamitani brought to everything he directed. It never left Japan officially, which is the entire explanation for its Western obscurity. Fan translations exist and make the game fully accessible, and it holds up as a playable experience rather than just a historical artifact worth admiring from a distance. The RPG systems are simpler than what Odin's Sphere would develop into, and the game is shorter than modern players might expect going in. But as the origin point of one of the most distinctive visual styles in action RPG history, Princess Crown is essential context, and the Saturn version remains the definitive way to experience it.
Dragon Force is the Saturn RPG
that people who know the Saturn library bring up most often when the conversation turns to what the platform had that nothing else did. A strategy game where you command armies of up to 100 soldiers per battle, where individual unit types counter each other in a framework that scales up to engagements covering the entire screen. It was technically impressive in ways that the PlayStation's architecture made difficult to replicate, and that hardware advantage gave working design something genuinely unique to localize. 8 different kingdoms, 8 different playable rulers, and a strategic layer where the political decisions you make between battles shape what resources and alliances you're working with in the next engagement. The replayability is real. Running through the game as Wine feels like a fundamentally different political and tactical experience than playing as Gongos or Tyrus. I went back multiple times specifically to see how the campaign restructured itself around different starting positions. The scale of the battles is still impressive by any standard. Watching formations of archers, soldiers, samurai, and mages collide across a scrolling battlefield while managing your commander's individual combat in the center of the fight creates a specific kind of chaos that Dragon Force manages to keep readable. It's one of the few games that made the Saturn feel like the right hardware choice rather than a consolation prize, and one of the best strategy RPGs ever made. Dark Savior is one of the most structurally unusual games the Saturn produced. It's a 3D action RPG with a parallel worlds mechanic that sends you through 5 different scenarios depending on decisions and timing in the opening section. The scenarios overlap and contradict each other in ways that were obviously deliberate. You're not just replaying slightly different versions of the same story. You're playing genuinely different games that share a world and a cast. The combat is isometric and uses a fighting game input system. Specific directional commands tied to normal and special attacks that give the moment-to-moment fighting a precision feel that most action RPGs didn't bother with. It takes time to internalize, and the early game is unforgiving about teaching you through failure rather than through a tutorial. That investment pays off once the inputs become muscle memory and the combat starts feeling fluid. The presentation is dark and atmospheric in a way that fits the branching structure. Dark Savior doesn't feel like a game that's trying to be cheerful about anything. Some of the scenarios are stronger than others, and the game is honest about that by making certain parallel paths feel like consequence routes for poor early play. It was overlooked because it was strange and demanding at a time when the Saturn was already losing mind share. Both of those qualities are reasons to seek it out now. Shining the Holy Ark is a first-person dungeon crawler in the tradition of the earlier Shining games, specifically Shining in the Darkness, brought to the Saturn with an aesthetic upgrade that made it feel genuinely impressive for its time. 3-dimensional dungeon environments with high-quality monster sprites, a companion system where small creatures join your party and assist in combat, and a story that took itself seriously enough to avoid the genre's usual tonal inconsistencies. The companion fairies that ride in the characters' pockets are the mechanical highlight. They absorb certain attacks that would otherwise hit your party, and discovering which companions are effective against which enemy types adds a layer of preparation to dungeon exploration that goes beyond simple gear management. I found myself paying attention to companion placement in ways I didn't expect the system to demand. The dungeon design is where the game earns its reputation. The layouts are complex without becoming frustrating. The map system is generous enough to support exploration, and the encounter rate is calibrated well enough that the game never feels like it's punishing you for moving. Shining the Holy Ark is the kind of game that the Saturn's library needed more of. A well-executed genre entry that took advantage of the hardware without being defined entirely by its technical ambitions. Linkle Liver Story is among the most obscure games on this list, even within Saturn circles. And a significant part of that is the title, which has kept people from taking it seriously for 30 years. Beneath that is a 2D action RPG with cooking mechanics, a female protagonist, and a tone that sits somewhere between fairy tale warmth and genuine emotional weight. A combination that was unusual in 1997 and remains unusual now in games of this scale. The cooking system is the central mechanic that everything else organizes around. You gather ingredients through exploration and combat, combine them into meals with specific effects, and those meals serve as your primary healing and buffing resource. It's not a side system bolted onto an existing RPG. It's the game's actual economy. And learning which ingredient combinations produce which results is the skill the game is genuinely teaching you across the full runtime. The art direction has a warmth that holds up better than most of the Saturn's 2D contemporaries, and the protagonist's design and personality were ahead of where action RPG leads usually were in that era. A fan translation makes it accessible now, and it's worth experiencing specifically because nothing else on the platform quite resembles it. Linkle Liver Story is the kind of game that only the Saturn library could have produced, which is both the reason it existed and the reason almost no one found it. Wakenroder is Japanese exclusive and has never received an official English translation, which means its obscurity in the West is almost entirely a language barrier problem rather than a quality one. It's a strategy RPG with a steampunk aesthetic and a tone darker than most of what the Saturn library offered. Political intrigue, moral ambiguity, and character deaths that the game earns through actual development rather than cheap, emotional manipulation. The tactical system uses a squad-based structure where unit cohesion matters as much as individual strength. Characters fight more effectively alongside specific allies, which creates a roster management layer that asks you to think about relationships between units rather than just their individual stats. I found myself developing preferences for specific pairings in a way that most strategy RPGs don't encourage. The art direction is the other thing worth noting. Wakenroder has a visual identity that still looks distinctive. The mechanical and architectural design feels genuinely European in a way that Japanese games of the era often approximated without committing to. The translation fan community has kept it alive for players willing to use patches, and it's worth the effort. This is one of the Saturn's hidden gems that stayed genuinely hidden because of the language problem rather than because nobody was paying attention.